Welcome, Nocturnal Minds, back to our class. Oh, you are really study hard. So, picking up from our last discussion on navigating life as a skeptic, let's dive into how ancient thinkers wrestled with the very foundation of knowledge. How do we even know what's true? Sextus Empiricus gives us a fantastic window into this through his work against the logicians. He doesn't just throw out theories, he meticulously reviews what others thought about the cruciation of truth, basically, what tool or method gets you closest to reality. Thinkers like Parmenides, Plato, Aristotle all weighed in, suggesting senses, reason, or some combo. It's a lively debate about the best way to get at the truth. Now, this feels like it's getting closer to what we might call an epistemic stance, a strategy for forming beliefs. But hold on, is it quite there yet? Let's nail down what we mean by an epistemic stance. Chakravarti suggests it's a strategy for generating factual beliefs. Okay, so when Sextus talks about using your senses or reason, does that count? Well, sort of. But then look at Chakravarti's own examples, scientific realism versus empiricism. That's a different ball game. Here, the question isn't how do I get the truth, but what kind of truth am I even looking for? A realist wants the deep, hidden nature of things, even if we can't see them directly. An empiricist, especially Van Frossen's flavor, says stick to what we can observe. These aren't just different tools, they're fundamentally different pictures of what scientific truth itself is like. So, while figuring out the criterion of truth is crucial groundwork, it's not the stance itself. It's more like choosing your weapon before deciding which battle you want to fight. This leads us to a fascinating observation. If we define an epistemic stance in terms of how you conceive of scientific truth, like realism versus empiricism, then looking back at ancient Greek philosophy, the range of options seems surprisingly narrow. Where are all the other contenders? The social constructivists? The verificationists? They seem almost non-existent in the landscape. Why this apparent lack of diversity? To understand this, we need to dig into the philosophical bedrock of the time, the assumptions that shaped how these thinkers even conceived of the possibility of scientific knowledge. Let's zoom in on one major player, the medical empiricists. The name itself is a clue, rooted in empiria, meaning experience. These guys, including Sextus himself, weren't big on fancy theories. Their motto was simple: if it works, it works. If a treatment reliably cured patients in the past, they expected it to work again, barring any weird new circumstances. Think of it like a highly successful, evidence-based practice manual for medicine. They built their entire system on observed correlations. Symptom X responds well to treatment Y. How did they handle new cases? By finding the closest analogy in their vast database of past experiences, what they called the transition to the similar. For them, effective practice was mastering this repertoire of proven routines. That was the whole shebang. So who were the empiricists arguing against? Primarily, the rationalists or dogmatists, as Galen called them. The key difference? Rationalists weren't afraid to go beyond mere observation. They didn't just collect successful treatments, they asked why they worked. This led them down a rabbit hole exploring the body's hidden mechanisms, maybe even dabbling in general physics. For them, a symptom wasn't just a cluster of observable complaints, it was a sign pointing to something deeper, an underlying disease operating at an unobservable level. The empiricists? They had no truck with that. Symptoms were just symptoms, a collection of things happening. Their only concern was alleviating those things, not figuring out the hidden cause. One group was building theories about the unseen, the other was sticking to the seen. Okay, so we have these two medical schools, empiricists focused on observable success, rationalists on underlying causes. Does this make the empiricists empiricists in the way we usually think of the term today, especially in philosophy of science? Like, do they represent an empiricist stance about seeking scientific truth? The answer here is a resounding no, and the reason is subtle but crucial. They didn't develop theories at all. Or rather, they weren't in the business of seeking scientific truth in the sense that involves explanation or understanding. Their truths were simply correlations. Treatment A works for condition B. There was no attempt to explain why A works, not even for the sake of improving future practice. They just followed what worked. They weren't doing science. They were running a highly effective, empirically grounded medical practice. So, what was the real disagreement between the empiricists and the rationalists? It wasn't about methodology in the way we might frame it. Both groups presumably used observation. The core issue was whether to engage in theoretical inquiry at all. The empiricists basically said, science is impossible, It's full of conflicting theories about things we can never see, like anatomy revealing hidden organs. Forget it, we'll just be practitioners and use what works. They abandoned the scientific enterprise altogether. Interestingly, though, they seem to share the same idea of what successful science would look like with their opponents, grasping the real, underlying nature of things, often involving unobservables. Their beef was that this goal was unattainable due to the inherent disputes among theories. This brings us squarely into the orbit of Sextus Empiricus' Pyrrhonian skepticism. Remember how the medical empiricists rejected anatomy because it aimed to discover hidden workings? Well, Sextus makes a similar move. He argues against the very possibility of having signs, reliable indicators, for things that are inherently non-manifest, things that can never be directly observed, like atoms or pores. This sounds remarkably like the skeptical challenge to theoretical knowledge. It seems both Sextus and the medical empiricists ended up rejecting the scientific enterprise, not by proposing a radically different way to do science, but by concluding it was fundamentally flawed or impossible. They both seem to step away from the table of scientific theorizing. Now, let's get specific about Sextus' take on science, because this is where his skepticism really grinds gears. He distinguishes between things that are unclear by nature, like atoms, never seen, and things that are unclear for the moment, like fire behind a hill, currently hidden. Correspondingly, he splits signs into two types. First, indicative signs, indictica. These are supposed to reveal the inherently unobservable. Think observing sweat and inferring pores must exist to produce it. You need an inference leap to something you can never directly see. Second, recollective signs, hypomnestica. These are more like mental triggers. Seeing smoke reminds you that smoke and fire are usually correlated, so you infer fire is nearby, even if obscured. Notice the language, recollection, commemoration. It suggests a passive association, not rigorous logical deduction. And here's Sextus' crucial move. He spends a lot of time dismantling the idea of indicative signs. His goal is to show that believing in them leads to suspension of judgment. But guess what? He freely admits to using recollective signs all the time in everyday life. He draws a sharp line. Indicative signs are the playground of theorists, the dogmatists like the rationalist doctors. Recollective signs? That's just how ordinary people navigate the world. Sextus explicitly sides with ordinary life against the fictions of the thinkers. What's the implication? If you stick to recollective signs, you're safe, you're just living your life normally. But if you start believing in indicative signs, you're stepping into the realm of constructing theories about the real nature of things, which, for Sextus, is a path to confusion and dogmatism. Avoiding indicative signs becomes synonymous with avoiding theory. Here's a fascinating twist. Despite rejecting theoretical inquiry, both Sextus and the empiricist doctors seem to share a remarkably similar conception of what such theorizing would involve. They both seem to assume that successful science means positing real, underlying entities that we can't see, and using these to explain the phenomena we do see. They both doubt this is possible because verifying such theories seems impossible. This leads us to Berniet's influential idea. Ancient Greek philosophy, broadly speaking, operated under an unquestioned assumption of realism. There's an objective world out there, independent of us, and the goal of inquiry is to uncover how things truly are in that world. If you accept this basic premise, it's hard to imagine alternative views of what science is doing, like social constructivism or relativism, taking root. Those ideas seem alien to this fundamental worldview. This realism wasn't just about ontology, it shaped how they viewed epistemology too. Relativism, the idea that truth is somehow shaped by perspective, framework, or societal context, seems genuinely foreign to the ancient Greeks. Sure, Protagoras famously said man is the measure of all things, which sounds relativistic. But interpretations vary, and generally, the consensus was that your background affects how you perceive things, but not how the world itself is constituted. Perspective was seen as a potential obstacle to knowing the objective truth, not as a factor in creating it. Reality was assumed to be out there, solid and independent, waiting to be discovered. Anything suggesting that our social or psychological context fundamentally shapes reality would have been met with bewilderment. So, if ancient philosophy was steeped in this kind of realism, what does that mean for different epistemic stances? It means that stances like social constructivism, which denies an objective reality independent of human thought, are ruled out from the get-go. Similarly, instrumentalism, which reduces scientific theories to mere tools for prediction or observation, or verificationism, which ties truth to what can be verified, also seem unlikely candidates. Why? Because if everyone assumes science is about uncovering objective truth about a real world, there's no inherent motivation to try and reduce it to something else. Now, could realism itself be considered a stance? Probably not in the reflective sense, since it wasn't articulated as a choice among alternatives. And if realism was the only game in town, then voluntarism about stances, the idea that different stances could be equally rational choices, becomes impossible. You can't choose between stances if you don't even conceive of having a choice. Okay, so the ancients didn't really have a debate about epistemic stances like realism versus constructivism, because realism was the default setting. But could Pyrrhonian skepticism, in principle, have tackled such a debate? Could a Pyrrhonist take the opposing arguments for realism, constructivism, verificationism, and so on, and arrange them to achieve that characteristic equal strength, leading to suspension of judgment about which stance is correct? Logically, it seems possible. It fits the Pyrrhonian method. So why didn't they do it? Likely because the deep-seated realism made it unthinkable. However, this raises another interesting question. Even if Pyrrhonists didn't apply their method to stances, does Pyrrhonian skepticism itself allow for voluntarism about stances? Is there any room for the idea that different stances could be equally rational choices within the Pyrrhonian framework? Actually, let's shift gears slightly. While the question of voluntarism about stances is intriguing, the Pyrrhonists themselves were far more concerned with individual beliefs. That's where their skeptical practice is most clearly visible. So let's focus on that. How does Pyrrhonian skepticism relate to voluntarism about individual beliefs? If we can figure out their relationship here, we can probably extrapolate to stances. The core idea of voluntarism, remember, is that different incompatible beliefs about facts can be rationally permissible choices for different people. Now let's pit voluntarism against Pyrrhonian skepticism. Voluntarism says, hey, it's okay for you to believe P and for me to believe not P, as long as both are rationally permissible choices. Pyrrhonian skepticism, however, is fundamentally about getting you to stop believing anything definite about matters of fact, especially complex, theoretical ones. Its goal isn't to certify any belief as permissible, it's to subvert belief altogether. Think about it. Voluntarism is actively giving permission to hold certain beliefs. Pyrrhonian skepticism is trying to get you to cease holding beliefs. They seem to be pulling in opposite directions. The skeptic isn't interested in saying, it's okay to believe this. They're interested in saying, don't believe anything. How does Pyrrhonian skepticism actually work? Sextus gives us the blueprint. Skepticism produces oppositions. You lay out all the conflicting arguments and impressions about a topic. Then comes the crucial step, equal strength. This isn't about logical parity, it's psychological. You make the opposing views seem equally convincing, equally persuasive. Often this involves highlighting the counterintuitive arguments to balance out the obvious ones. And the result? Suspension of judgment. Again, this is a psychological effect, not a logical conclusion. You feel no more pulled towards one side than the other. You reach a state of no more. This suspension applies, according to Sextus, to any matter investigated via the sciences, meaning theoretical beliefs are definitely off limits. So, putting it together, Pyrrhonian skepticism aims to eliminate belief in theoretical matters. Voluntarism aims to permit belief in certain matters. Pyrrhonian skepticism aims to induce suspension of judgment. Voluntarism aims to certify the permissibility of belief. They seem fundamentally opposed. Now someone might try to reconcile them by saying, well, if suspension of judgment means neither belief is better, doesn't that imply both are equally permissible? But that misses the spirit of voluntarism, which is about giving permission to believe. The skeptic isn't granting permission. They're trying to prevent you from forming a belief in the first place. They won't let any belief stand unchallenged. So, while there's a superficial similarity in saying neither is better, Pyrrhonian skepticism fundamentally rejects the idea that either belief is permissible. Where could skepticism and voluntarism find common ground? Not, I think, in the strict Pyrrhonian tradition. But look at the later phase of the Platonic Academy, particularly figures like Philo of Larissa and Cicero. This is mitigated skepticism. These thinkers, while still acknowledging the impossibility of certainty, weren't quite as radical as Sextus. They allowed that some impressions could be persuasive or probable, leading to a kind of tentative, provisional belief. Cicero, for instance, famously adopts Stoic ethical views in his work on duties, albeit in a provisional way. This suggests a willingness to accept beliefs, albeit carefully qualified ones. Could this mitigated skepticism pave the way for voluntarism? Imagine a scenario where two opposing philosophical positions seem equally persuasive, but neither has overwhelming justification. A mitigated skeptic might say, "Fine, I'll provisionally accept whichever one seems more convincing right now, but I'm suspending judgment on the ultimate truth." Since the mitigated skeptic isn't claiming absolute certainty for any position, why insist on one being demonstrably superior to the other? If equally persuasive alternatives are acceptable on a provisional basis, then perhaps either could be adopted as a permissible choice, making room for a limited form of voluntarism. Again, this is speculative. No ancient text explicitly argues this, but the spirit of mitigated skepticism doesn't seem to rule it out entirely. Ultimately, though this potential rapprochement relies on softening the edges of skepticism, mitigated skepticism represents a step back from the rigorous suspension of judgment that defines both the earlier academics and, crucially, Sextus's Pyrrhonism. It's precisely this dissatisfaction with the Academy's softening that led Anisidemus to revive the Pyrrhonian approach. So, returning to our main subject, for Sextus and the Pyrrhonists, the verdict is clear. Pyrrhonian skepticism and voluntarism, whether about individual beliefs or broader epistemic stances, fundamentally clash. They don't mix. That's the takeaway from this exploration.